Imagine standing on a coastline that didn't exist 8,000 years ago. You're looking out at water dark and still, stretching to the horizon. But beneath those waves, hundreds of feet down, there's an entire world. Not just rocks and sediment, houses, tools, pottery, graves, the remnants of people who lived and died thinking their home would last forever. They were wrong. Around 7,600 years ago, something catastrophic happened at the edge of the Black Sea. The Mediterranean, swollen with melting glaciers, finally broke through the narrow land barrier that held it back. Water didn't trickle in, it exploded. A waterfall larger than anything on Earth today, possibly 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls, roared through what we now call the Bosphorus Strait. The noise would have been heard for miles, the ground would have shaken, and every single day the sea advanced further inland, swallowing everything in its path. If you were living on the shores of what was then a freshwater lake, you had two choices: run or drown. Thousands chose to run, and they carried with them a memory so traumatic, so universally devastating, that it echoed across continents and down through millennia. A memory of the world ending in water, of everything familiar disappearing beneath the waves, of desperate migrations, lost homes, and the overwhelming sense that the gods themselves had turned against humanity. This is the story of the Black Sea deluge, and it might just be the single event that gave birth to nearly every ancient flood myth you've ever heard. Gilgamesh, Noah, Deucalion, Manu. The parallels are too specific, too detailed, too widespread to ignore. But here's what makes this different from most ancient mysteries. We can actually investigate it. Underwater archaeologists have been diving into the Black Sea for decades, and what they're finding is extraordinary. Preserved shorelines, ancient river valleys, and yes, signs of human habitation, frozen in time beneath hundreds of feet of water. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time. I check comments and it's always fascinating. Tokyo at dawn, London at midnight, all listening to the same drowned world. Before we dive deeper, if you're enjoying this kind of journey through prehistoric mysteries, I've written about these exact moments in history. The lost worlds and forgotten catastrophes in the Sleepy Time History book. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com if you're curious. But right now, let's go back. Back to a time when the Black Sea wasn't a sea at all, when it was smaller, shallower, and surrounded by some of the most fertile land on Earth. Back to a world that was about to be erased by the greatest flood in human memory. Picture a lake. Not an ocean, not a sea, a lake. Vast, yes, stretching hundreds of miles across what is now the Black Sea basin, but still fundamentally a freshwater body, completely cut off from the salt waters of the Mediterranean. Its surface sat roughly 150 meters, nearly 500 feet below current sea level. The shoreline that ring this ancient lake is now so deep underwater that submersibles have to navigate through complete darkness just to reach it. This was the New Euxine Lake, as geologists call it. And for thousands of years after the last ice age ended, it was paradise. The climate around the lake was mild, moderated by the massive body of fresh water at its centre. Winters weren't harsh, summers weren't scorching. Rivers fed by melting mountain snow flowed down from the surrounding highlands, carrying nutrients that made the lake shores incredibly fertile. The water teemed with fish, freshwater species that had adapted over millennia to this isolated ecosystem. The grasslands and forests surrounding the lake supported deer, wild cattle, boar. Everything a human community could want, and humans definitely wanted it. The archaeological evidence, what little we can access from such depths, suggest that by 8,000 years ago, possibly earlier, people had been living along these shores for generations. These weren't nomadic hunter-gatherers desperately chasing game across barren landscapes. These were communities in transition. Some still relied primarily on fishing and hunting, but others were beginning to experiment with cultivation, planting seeds, tending crops, keeping animals penned rather than hunted. This was the Neolithic revolution happening in real time, and the Black Sea Basin was one of its laboratories. The conditions were ideal: reliable water supply, fertile soil deposited by river deltas, abundant wild resources to fall back on if crops failed, flat terrain perfect for early farming, mild enough climate that you didn't need sophisticated shelter or clothing technology, just the basics: wood, stone, animal hides, simple pottery for storage, maybe some woven textiles. We know from sites on the current coastline, the areas that weren't completely submerged, that communities here lived in small villages, 20, 30, maybe 50 people at a time. Rectangular houses with wooden frames and clay walls, hearths in the centre for cooking and warmth, storage pits for grain, pens for domesticated animals, probably sheep and goats brought from the south through trading networks. Daily life would have revolved around the lake. Fishing at dawn, nets cast from simple boats or from the shore. Women and children gathering plants, nuts, shellfish along the beaches. Men hunting in the forest slightly inland or tending to the animals. In spring and summer, everyone would have worked the fields, such as they were. Not vast agricultural complexes, but small plots cleared from forest or grassland, planted with early varieties of wheat and barley. The rhythm was seasonal, but reliable. The lake didn't flood unpredictably. It rose and fell slightly with the rains and snowmelt, but these changes were gradual, manageable. You could plan around them. Build your house just far enough from the water's edge that spring flooding wouldn't reach it, but close enough that you had easy access year-round, and crucially, you were protected. The lake was landlocked, completely isolated from the Mediterranean by a ridge of land where the Bosphorus Strait now cuts through. This wasn't some fragile barrier. It was solid bedrock, elevated perhaps 200 meters above the lake surface. On the other side, the Sea of Marmara, and beyond it, the Mediterranean sat much, much higher, swollen with meltwater from the retreating glaciers, but the barrier held. Had held for thousands of years. As far as anyone living on the lake shores knew, it had always held and always would. Why would you worry about water from the other side? You couldn't even see it. The land between was hills and valleys, probably wooded, possibly home to other communities who had no idea they were living on borrowed time. Think about what this means archaeologically. Every village built along that ancient shoreline, every fishing camp, every seasonal settlement, every burial ground, every trash heap full of pottery shards and animal bones and broken tools, all of it is now under 150 meters of water. Deeper in some places, shallower in others depending on the ancient topography, but all hopelessly submerged. This makes the drowned Black Sea coastline one of the richest and most inaccessible archaeological sites on the planet. We're not talking about a few scattered artifacts in shallow water. We're talking about an entire inhabited landscape, potentially hundreds of kilometers of coastline supporting dozens or even hundreds of settlements, all perfectly preserved in the cold, low-oxygen environment of the deep Black Sea. The freshwater lake didn't just support life, it shaped it. The people here developed their own distinct cultures, their own technologies, their own social systems. They traded with communities further inland. They probably had their own languages, their own stories, their own gods. They married, raised children, grew old, and died thinking this world was permanent. It wasn't. But they couldn't have known what was coming. couldn't have known that the barrier holding back the Mediterranean was eroding. That pressure was building, that somewhere around 5600 BCE, everything they knew was about to end. Between 9,000 and 7,000 years ago, human society was undergoing its most profound transformation since the invention of language. The Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to farming and settlement. And it wasn't happening in one place. It was spreading like wildfire across a vast arc of territory, from Anatolia through the Levant, up into the Balkans, across to the Caucasus. The Black Sea Basin sat right in the middle of this transformation, a crossroads where different cultural currents met, mixed, and created something unique. To the south, in central Anatolia, communities like Çatalhöyük were already building what we might generously call proto-cities. 9,000 people, maybe more, living in densely packed mud brick houses with no streets between them. You entered through the roof, climbing down a ladder into your home. The walls were plastered and painted with elaborate murals, bulls and vultures and strange geometric patterns, shrines filled with cattle skulls and goddess figurines. These weren't villages anymore. This was urban living. Specialized crafts, complex social hierarchies, organized religion. All the building blocks of civilization emerging in real time. Further west, the Balkan Neolithic cultures were developing their own sophisticated traditions. The Karanovo culture in what's now Bulgaria created tells, settlement mounds built up over centuries as successive generations built new houses on the ruins of old ones. Layer after layer of occupation, each one leaving behind pottery, tools, animal bones, the debris of daily life compressed into archaeological gold. The Vinča culture, spreading across modern Serbia and Romania, took pottery to levels that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. Their ceramics weren't just functional. They were art. Elaborate swirling designs, burnished black surfaces that gleamed like metal, figurines with eerily modern-looking faces. And they developed something else, a system of symbols, marks carved into pottery and clay tablets. Not quite writing, but close. Systematic record-keeping of some kind. Numbers, maybe. Property markers. Something important enough to standardize across multiple settlements. To the east, communities in the Caucasus were experimenting with metallurgy. Copper first, hammered and shaped into tools and ornaments. This was the cutting edge of technology. The knowledge that you could take certain rocks, heat them to extraordinary temperatures, and produce a substance that could be shaped into any form you wanted. It must have seemed like magic. All of these cultures were connected, not politically. There were no empires yet, no unified states, but through trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles. Obsidian from Anatolian volcanoes showing up in Balkan settlements. Copper from Caucasian mines appearing in sites across the region, shell ornaments from the Mediterranean found in inland villages, and ideas travelled even faster than goods, farming techniques, pottery styles, religious concepts, burial customs, information flowing along the same trade routes that carried physical objects, transforming every community it touched. The people living around the Black Sea Lake were part of this network. Had to be. The archaeological evidence from surrounding regions makes that clear. When we find sites on the current Black Sea coast, the ones that weren't completely submerged, they show clear connections to all these cultures. Pottery styles similar to Vinča, figurines reminiscent of Çatalhöyük, copper tools that could have come from Caucasian workshops. These were farming communities, not just dabbling in agriculture but committed to it. They grew emmer wheat and einkorn, early domesticated varieties that required careful cultivation. They kept sheep, goats, cattle, pigs. They stored grain in large ceramic vessels, insurance against bad harvests. They built permanent houses designed to last generations, not the temporary shelters of nomadic hunters. Their settlements followed a pattern we see across the Neolithic Near East. Houses arranged in loose clusters, sometimes surrounded by defensive ditches or palisades. Not because they were constantly at war. Archaeological evidence suggests these early farming communities were relatively peaceful, but because organisation and boundaries mattered. This is our space. That's yours. Basic property concepts emerging as people invested more labour in fixed locations. The spiritual world of these communities was rich and complex. Goddess figurines appear at almost every Neolithic site in the region. Squat, corpulent female forms with exaggerated breasts and hips. Some archaeologists interpret these as fertility symbols, representations of an Earth Mother goddess worshipped across the region. Others think they might be ancestral figures, representations of important women, clan mothers whose memory was kept alive through physical objects. The truth is, we don't know, can't know. These people left no written records explaining their beliefs, but the consistency of these figurines across thousands of miles suggests they meant something important, something worth the time and effort to craft carefully and keep safely. Burial customs show similar sophistication. The dead weren't just discarded. They were prepared, positioned carefully, sometimes accompanied by grave goods. Pottery vessels presumably containing food for the journey to whatever afterlife these people imagined. Tools to use in the next world. Ornaments, beads, shells. Evidence that death wasn't seen as an ending but a transformation. Some burials show evidence of ancestor veneration. Bodies interred beneath house floors, kept close to the living. Skulls sometimes removed and curated separately, possibly displayed in household shrines. This suggests a belief system where the dead remained part of the community, watching over their descendants, requiring respect and offerings. This wasn't primitive superstition. This was sophisticated theology, abstract thinking about existence, death, continuity. The same cognitive abilities that let them plan harvest seasons and manage livestock also let them contemplate questions that still occupy us today. What happens when we die? Do we continue somehow? How should we honour those who came before? These Black Sea communities were on the cusp of something unprecedented. They had mastered the basics of food production. They'd created stable settlements that could support larger populations than any hunter-gatherer band. They'd developed trade networks and social systems capable of maintaining cooperation across multiple generations. They were building the foundation of the ancient world, the world of cities and temples and kings and empires. They just didn't know it yet, and they definitely didn't know that all of it, every house and field and fishing boat and shrine, was about to be swept away by water that had been building pressure on the other side of a limestone barrier for thousands of years. While those Neolithic communities were building their world around the Black Sea Lake, completely unaware of what was coming, the entire planet was transforming around them. The end of the Ice Age wasn't a local phenomenon. It was global catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. For the last 2.5 million years, Earth had been locked in a cycle of ice ages and brief warm periods. The pattern was predictable enough. Temperatures drop, ice sheets advance from the poles, sea levels fall as more water gets locked up in glaciers. Then something triggers warming, the ice melts, seas rise, and for a few thousand years the planet enjoys a relatively stable climate before the cycle repeats. Around 20,000 years ago, the last ice age reached its maximum extent. Glaciers covered most of Canada, Scandinavia, northern Britain. Ice sheets miles thick grinding slowly southward, crushing everything beneath them. Sea levels were about 400 feet lower than today. Coastlines extended far beyond their current boundaries. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain and Ireland were connected to continental Europe by a vast lowland plain called Doggerland. Then the warming began. Not all at once, not everywhere, but steadily, year by year, the ice started melting. And when glaciers melt, all that water has to go somewhere. Between 18,000 and 8,000 years ago, sea levels rose about 390 feet. That's not a steady climb. It happened in fits and starts, periods of gradual increase punctuated by sudden dramatic surges when massive ice dams failed and entire glacial lakes emptied into the ocean in days or weeks. Geologists call these events meltwater pulses. The evidence is written in sediment cores and coral reefs worldwide. Periods when sea level jumped 10, 20, sometimes 50 feet in less than a century. For human communities living on coastlines, these would have been apocalyptic events. Fishing villages swallowed by rising tides, hunting grounds transformed into seafloor, entire landscapes drowned faster than a single human lifetime. Doggerland vanished beneath the North Sea. Not instantly, but over several thousand years, the rising waters steadily chewed away at that flat, fertile plain where thousands of people had lived for millennia. Archaeological surveys using seismic equipment have mapped the drowned landscape, river valleys, lake beds, even the remains of settlements, all now buried under hundreds of feet of cold North Sea water. In Southeast Asia, the Sunda Shelf flooded. This was an enormous landmass, larger than India, connecting Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines into a single continent. As sea levels rose, it broke apart into islands, communities that had been neighbours separated by hundreds of miles of ocean. Land bridges that had allowed migration and trade for thousands of years simply ceased to exist. The Persian Gulf filled with water. 15,000 years ago it was a river valley, a fertile corridor where early farming communities may have flourished. By 8,000 years ago it was an ocean inlet, and every settlement that had existed there was buried under salt water. This was happening everywhere. The Baltic Sea expanded northward, swallowing coastal settlements around its margins. The Torres Strait between Australia and New Guinea flooded, separating populations that had been connected for tens of thousands of years. The coastline of North America receded miles inland in some places, drowning river mouths and estuaries where rich ecosystems had supported dense human populations. For the people living through this, the changes would have been impossible to ignore. An elder might remember fishing a particular reef as a child, only to watch it disappear beneath the waves by the time she had grandchildren. Rivers that had flowed to the sea for generations suddenly ended in lagoons and marshes as the ocean crept upstream. Sacred sites, burial grounds, entire villages abandoned as the water advanced year after year. And all this water had to end up somewhere. The Mediterranean was rising, fed by meltwater from alpine glaciers, from the Pyrenees, from mountain ranges across southern Europe. The inland sea steadily climbed against its rocky shores, islands shrank, coastal plains vanished, and the water level crept higher and higher toward a narrow limestone ridge at the Bosporus. This was the barrier, the dam holding back the Mediterranean from the Black Sea basin. It wasn't much, just a ridge of rock maybe 150 feet higher than the lake on the other side, but for thousands of years it held. Water from the Mediterranean lapped at its base, maybe 200 feet below the top. Water from the Black Sea lake on the other side sat several hundred feet lower still, a freshwater basin fed by rivers but isolated from the ocean by that thin geological barrier. The Sea of Marmara, sitting between them like a geological stepping stone, was rising too, slowly filling as the Mediterranean spilled in through the Dardanelles. The pressure was building, literally. The weight of all that water pressing against rock that had been eroded by rain and wind and frost for millennia. Geologists now think the Bosporus Ridge was already under stress. Earthquakes were common in the region, the boundary between tectonic plates grinding against each other. The rock was limestone, relatively soft, prone to solution by water. Underground channels and caves were almost certainly forming as the rising Mediterranean found weak points to exploit. But for the moment, it held. The people farming around the Black Sea lake had no idea they were living at the bottom of a bowl, protected from the ocean by a geological accident that was rapidly approaching its breaking point. Everywhere else, the post-Ice Age flooding had been gradual, terrible, life-disrupting, forcing mass migrations and cultural transformations, but slow enough that people could adapt, move inland, build new settlements on higher ground, adjust to the changing world. What was about to happen at the Black Sea would be different. Not a gradual rise over centuries, but a catastrophic breach. The day the Mediterranean finally broke through, it would arrive not as a slowly advancing tide, but as a waterfall you could hear from miles away. The moment itself probably didn't look special. Maybe it was a clear morning. Maybe there was a faint tremor in the ground that nobody understood. A fisherman in a small reed boat on the Black Sea lake. A woman walking the shoreline checking fish traps. Children playing near the water's edge. Somewhere beneath their feet, in the limestone spine of the Bosporus, a crack widened. In 1997, two marine geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pitman, tried to reconstruct what happened next. Looking at sediment cores, seismic profiles, and the topography of the sea floor, they proposed a scenario that sounds less like geology and more like a disaster myth. According to their hypothesis, around 7,600 years ago, the rising Mediterranean finally overtopped the Bosporus sill. At first it would have been a trickle, water finding a low point in the ridge, but water under pressure doesn't stay a trickle for long. Once it started cutting down into the soft limestone, erosion accelerated. A narrow channel deepened, widening with every hour, every day. The difference in water level between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea basin was enormous. More than 150 meters. The Mediterranean, now connected to the global ocean, stood far higher than the isolated freshwater lake beyond the ridge. So when that natural dam failed, it wasn't just a spillover. It was a wall of ocean trying to fill a basin the size of a small sea. Ryan and Pitman calculated the flow. If their numbers are even close, water would have rushed through the Bosporus Strait with 200 times the force of Niagara Falls. Not for minutes, not for days, for months, possibly for years. Imagine standing anywhere near that channel. The sound alone would have been overwhelming, a constant thunder like an endless storm. The ground trembling continuously as millions of tons of water per second tore through the rock, stripping soil and boulders, deepening the strait into the steep-sided channel we see today. On the other side, in the Black Sea basin, the effect would have been no less dramatic, just slower, and in some ways more terrifying. The lake level began to rise. In steep coastal areas, the shoreline might have advanced in lurches, climbing terraces, swallowing cliffs and coves over months and years. But on the broad lowland plains, where Neolithic farmer had chosen their land carefully for its flat fields and gentle slopes, the waterline could have moved frighteningly fast. Ryan and Pitman estimated that in the flattest regions, the shoreline might have advanced as much as a mile per day. Think about what that means for the people living there. You wake up one morning and the water is a little closer than yesterday. Maybe you move your boat higher on shore, grumble about strange tides. By late afternoon, the spot where your children have been playing is under water. By the next morning, the path you used to walk to your fields is gone. A few days later, the fields themselves are a shallow bay. There is no single towering wave, no cinematic wall of water. Just an implacable, relentless rise. Every sunrise the sea is closer. Every sunset another line of familiar landmarks disappears. Villages that had stood for generations, where ancestors were buried, where boundary stones marked fields and memories, would have been swallowed within weeks. People would have tried to adapt at first, moving houses a little higher uphill, rebuilding storage pits, replastering hearths. But the water would not stop. In some places, entire river valleys were drowned. Streams that had once flowed down to a quiet freshwater shore suddenly backed up, their mouths transformed into broad estuaries as the rising salt water pushed inland. Boats had to be built. New fishing grounds had to be found. Fields carefully cleared and tended by generations of farmers vanished under brackish shallows. The Black Sea itself changed identity. Before the breach, it had been a large but modest freshwater lake, fed by rivers from the north and west. Its outlets were small, its ecosystem stable, adapted to low salinity. After the Mediterranean broke through, the basin began to fill toward a new equilibrium. Over time, the water level climbed by more than 150 meters, drowning tens of thousands of square kilometers of land until it approached something like its modern extent. And as the level rose, the nature of the water itself shifted. The first clue to this transformation comes from deep beneath the seafloor. Marine geologists have pulled long cores of mud and sediment from the Black Sea basin, each layer a thin page in the region's environmental history. Near the bottom of these cores, the sediments tell a freshwater story. The fossils are of organisms that thrive in lakes and rivers, freshwater mollusks, diatoms adapted to low salinity, pollen from plants that prefer shores of calm, non-salty water. Then, abruptly, the story changes. Above a sharp boundary, the fossils shift to marine species, shells and microorganisms that live only in salty water. The chemistry of the sediments changes too, showing an influx of sulfate and other ions associated with seawater. It's like flipping a switch in the geological record. From lake to sea in a very short span of time, at least on geological scales. Along the margins of the modern Black Sea, sonar surveys and underwater mapping have revealed something else: submerged shorelines. Ancient terraces, beach ridges and coastal features now sitting hundreds of feet below the surface. Drowned river channels cut into what used to be dry land. They all point to a past coastline much lower than the present one, and then a rapid transgression as water flooded the basin. Together, these lines of evidence form the backbone of the Ryan and Pitman hypothesis. A dramatic breach, a catastrophic inflow, a basin transformed from freshwater lake to inland sea within perhaps a human lifetime or a few generations at most. Not everyone agrees with the catastrophic version. Some geologists argue that while the Mediterranean did eventually connect to the Black Sea, the process may have been more gradual. According to this view, the difference in water level might have been smaller, the inflow less like Niagara Falls on steroids, and more like a powerful but steady river. The rise in Black Sea level would still have been significant, still enough to flood Neolithic settlements and reshape coastlines, but spread out over centuries rather than decades. In this interpretation, the sediment boundary between freshwater and saltwater isn't necessarily a single moment, but a compressed record of a transition that took longer. Erosion of the Bosporus sill could have been incremental, with pulses of inflow triggered by storms, earthquakes and periodic sea level surges. Other researchers sit somewhere in between. They accept that there was likely a substantial difference in water level, and that once the connection was established the inflow would have been energetic and erosive. But they caution against imagining a single apocalyptic day. Even a catastrophic flood in geological terms might still unfold over several decades, a creeping disaster instead of a single instant of destruction. The debate is ongoing and probably will be for a long time. New cores, better dating methods, more detailed maps of the seafloor. Each piece of evidence adds nuance to the picture. But whatever the exact rate of rise, almost all reconstructions agree on a few key points. The Mediterranean did break through. The Black Sea basin did flood on a massive scale. Freshwater ecosystems were replaced by marine ones. Human communities living along that ancient shoreline watched their world drown and were forced to move, to adapt, or to disappear. For them, it wouldn't have mattered whether the shoreline advanced a mile a day or a mile a year. What they experienced was simple and terrifying. The boundary between land and water, which their grandparents had trusted as stable, suddenly became unreliable. The safe places were no longer safe. The fields were no longer fields. The lake was no longer a lake. And as the water rose, people would have made choices, some hurriedly dismantling houses, carrying what they could to higher terraces, some taking to boats, following the receding line of familiar landmarks as long as possible, others refusing to leave until the last moment, until the water lapped at their doorposts and seeped into their hearths. They would have argued about what was happening, some blaming the spirits, some insisting it was just an unusual season, that the water would recede, children growing up in the middle of it, never knowing a world that wasn't shrinking, always being told about villages and fields that existed before the water came. Whether the deluge was fast or relatively slow for those living through it, it must have felt like the end of an age, a quiet apocalypse, measured not in crashing waves, but in the steady loss of everything familiar. But human beings rarely disappear without a trace. They move. They carry their habits, their technologies, and their stories with them. As the Black Sea swallowed their homeland, the people of its shores scattered, and in the drowned silence they left behind, the seabed began preserving a different kind of record, one that modern archaeologists are just beginning to read. If you could drain the Black Sea like a bathtub, the first thing you'd notice is that the past never really left. It's still down there. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the same man who found the Titanic went looking for those ghosts. Robert Ballard, oceanographer and deep-sea explorer, turned his attention away from Atlantic liners and ancient triremes and pointed his sonar toward the Black Sea. What drew him wasn't just the flood hypothesis. It was a whisper from the geology, an ancient shoreline now hundreds of feet underwater, frozen in place like a snapshot of the moment before everything changed. Ballard's team began with the maps. Using side-scan sonar and multi-beam bathymetry, they traced the contours of the seafloor the way a blind person reads Braille. Ridges, terraces, old river channels. Most of it was just drowned landscape. But then, lining the basin like a ring in a bathtub, they saw it. A sharply defined shelf, flat, continuous, sitting far below the modern coastline. It looked exactly like what you'd expect from an ancient lakeshore, stranded when the water rushed in and climbed higher. A fossil beach. They chose a section along the Turkish coast and lowered cameras into the dark. At first, mud, ripples in the sediment, occasional stones. Then, on one dive, the remotely operated vehicle drifted over something that didn't look natural at all. A line of squared-off shapes, angles, edges. Closer inspection showed what appeared to be worked timber protruding from the seafloor. Straight beams, aligned in ways that suggested walls, not driftwood. The sonar image of the area revealed a rectangular outline, post holes, patterns that, cautiously, always cautiously, looked like the footprint of a wooden structure. If that interpretation is right, those timbers had been sitting there for thousands of years, and they hadn't rotted away. They were preserved because the Black Sea is not like other seas. Below about 150 to 200 meters, most of its water is anoxic, almost completely devoid of oxygen. Over time, the heavy, salty Mediterranean water that poured in after the flood settled into deep layers. The lighter, fresher river water stayed near the surface. There is surprisingly little mixing between these layers. Without oxygen, the usual decomposers, bacteria, worms, wood-boring organisms, can't survive. Things that would crumble to nothing in a normal ocean just stop changing. Wood stops rotting. Rope stops disintegrating. Even soft tissues decay more slowly, protected by the silent, poisonous stillness of hydrogen, sulfide-rich depths. For an archaeologist, it's like stumbling across a naturally occurring time capsule the size of a small country. Ballard confirmed this in the most dramatic way possible. As his surveys continued, he and other teams began to find shipwrecks, not scattered piles of timbers and amphorae like in the Mediterranean, but intact vessels sitting upright on the seafloor as if they'd sunk yesterday. Some were Byzantine, some Ottoman, some probably later, hulls still tight, masts still standing. In some cases, cargo still stacked in the holds, ropes, leather, even parts of sails preserved, the fibres hardly touched by decay. Imagine a wooden ship that sank over 1,000 years ago, resting in black water where no worm can chew and no current can tear. The planks remain, the joinery is visible. In some wrecks, the carved details on the stern are still recognisable. These ghost ships are proof of concept. If a vessel built in the Middle Ages can sit in that environment and remain recognisable for a millennium, what else might be preserved down there from even earlier times, from before the deluge finished its work? That question has driven a quiet wave of underwater archaeology along the coasts of Bulgaria, Turkey, Romania and Georgia. On the continental shelves, the gently sloping regions closer to shore, Bulgarian and Turkish teams have been combing the seafloor with sonar and sub-bottom profilers. They are looking not in the deepest anoxic reaches, but in the shallower zones where Neolithic people would actually have lived before the flood advanced. They've begun to find hints. Off the Bulgarian coast, surveys have revealed submerged river valleys now drowned beneath 60 or 70 metres of water. Along their margins, patterns of anomalies appear, clusters of stones, odd rectilinear arrangements, concentrations of artefacts. Diving on some of these spots, archaeologists have recovered stone tools, blades, scrapers, and fragments of grinding stones that look very much like their counterparts on land-based Neolithic sites. In a few cases, they've found what appear to be worked wooden stakes driven into the ancient ground surface, suggesting fish weirs or simple structures along the old shoreline. Off Turkey, similar work has identified terraces that once would have been flat, dry land above the lake. On those terraces, cores pulled from the sediment have yielded charcoal, plant remains, and pottery shards at depths that match the hypothesized pre-flood water level. None of this is a lost city with streets and walls, not yet. It's more like the faintest pencil sketch of human presence on a landscape that no longer exists. And that's the maddening part. Because if Ryan and Pitman are even roughly correct, the main concentration of Neolithic lakeshore settlements, the best farmland, the safest harbours, the longest inhabited villages, would not have been right at the current edge of the shelf. They would have been lower, on ground that is now hundreds of metres down, under cold, dark, oxygen-starved water, and under layers of sediment slowly sifting down from the rivers above. The most important evidence lies in the least accessible place. Think of a village that stood on the old lake shore 3 or 4 generations before the flood. Mud brick houses, wattle and daub walls, wooden fences, storage pits full of grain, hearths ringed with stones blackened by thousands of fires, human burials and shallow graves nearby, marked with stones or simple markers. When the water rose, maybe most of the people left in time, maybe some structures were dismantled, but clay floors, post holes, wells, and heavier objects would have stayed in place as the shoreline crept over them. Eventually the site would have been drowned, first under a few metres of fresh water, then, as centuries passed and the sea rose higher, under brackish water, then fully marine, then, as the basin stratified, under a slowly thickening blanket of fine oxygen-poor mud. Down in that darkness, Organic material doesn't vanish. It waits. Timber foundations could still be there, embedded in ancient soils. Piles of household trash, bones, broken tools, discarded pottery might remain in situ. Fishing gear woven from plant fibres, baskets, wooden ploughs, even, in the best of circumstances, fragments of textiles, or plant-based building materials that would never survive on land, and bones, human remains, lying where they were buried before anyone suspected that the lake itself was temporary. If we could peel back the mud with infinite care, layer by layer, we might find entire neighbourhoods, house outlines, courtyards, paths trodden by bare feet, the last footprints of a vanished shore. But we can't. Not yet. Working at those depths is brutally difficult. Deep submergence vehicles and remotely operated robots can visit, but mapping wide areas with the precision archaeologists need is expensive and slow. Sediment obscures everything. Every promising anomaly is buried under meters of mud that must be probed delicately, without the direct eyes and hands that make traditional excavation possible. So for now, most of the Black Sea's Neolithic story is inferred rather than read. We see its margins, sites on land, scattered finds in shallow water, a few tantalizing timbers on an old submerged beach, and we imagine the rest. Still, the combination is suggestive. We know the basin flooded. We know people were there. We know the sea, once it deepened and stilled, became an extraordinary preservative, capable of keeping wooden ships intact for 1,000 years and more. Put those facts together, and it's hard not to wonder whether somewhere out on that drowned shelf lies a village almost perfectly frozen in time from the moment the waters took it. Boats pulled up on a strand that no longer sees the sun, storage jars still holding carbonized grains, tools laid down and never picked up again. Even the stories, though those, unlike timbers and bones, can only survive in living minds. For that, we have to look not into the water, but away from it, to the people who left the shores of the rising Black Sea behind, carrying their memories inland, up rivers, across mountains, into new lands that they would someday call home. When the water came, it didn't just erase a landscape, it released a wave of people. Every shoreline community, every farmstead on those low terraces, every fishing camp in every sheltered bay along that ancient freshwater lake suddenly had the same problem. The place that had fed them for generations was turning against them. They couldn't stay. Not all of them, not for long. So they began to move. At first it might have felt temporary, a bad season, an unlucky few years, the water creeping closer to the hearth, swallowing the lower fields, turning the familiar path to the well into a muddy inlet. You move your house upslope. You rebuild a little farther from the shore. You tell yourself it's fine. But the water keeps coming. A few centimetres a day doesn't sound like much. Over months and years it eats whole strips of coastline. The old village site disappears beneath a shallow bay. The graves of your grandparents vanish under a glinting surface where fish now swim. At some point it stops being an inconvenience and becomes a verdict. This place is dying. We go, or we drown with it. Where do you go when the centre of your world is sinking? If you stand on a high ridge and look away from the swelling sea, the options arrange themselves in directions. To the northwest, the valleys open toward the Balkans into what will one day be Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia. Rivers like the Mariya and Iskar offer natural corridors that lead, eventually, to the great highway of the Danube. To the south, low passes cross into Anatolia. Over the mountains, new plateaus wait, lands that will, in time, hold Çatalhöyük, Hacılar, and countless other Neolithic settlements. To the east, narrow coasts and rugged foothills trail along the southern flank of the Caucasus, where rivers cut inland toward the Kura and Rioni basins. These are not abstract arrows on a map. They are real routes, worn into the land, the same ones later armies, traders and pilgrims would follow. In the mid-6th millennium BCE, as the Black Sea swelled with Mediterranean water, those paths may have carried something else. Refugees. This is where the timing becomes suggestive. Archaeologists mapping the spread of early farming into Europe see a curious pattern. For centuries before, about 5600 BCE, agriculture creeps across the continent in a slow, almost leisurely wave. From Anatolia into Greece, then into the Balkans. New villages appear, pottery styles shift, domesticated wheat and barley show up in charred seeds. It's steady, but not dramatic. Then, between roughly 5600 and 5400 BCE, right in the window many researchers place the Black Sea flood, this pattern changes. The Neolithic doesn't just advance, it surges. Suddenly, along the Danube and its tributaries, in the plains of Hungary, in the valleys of what is now Romania and Serbia, you see an acceleration. Larger settlements, denser networks, distinctive pottery traditions springing up farther and faster than the earlier, slower front would have predicted. Some scholars describe it as a Neolithic diaspora out of the southeast. Others are more cautious, but the coincidence is hard to ignore. A proposed catastrophic flooding event on the Black Sea's margins, and at roughly the same time, a noticeable jump in how quickly farming lifeways spread into the heart of Europe. Genetics adds another thread. Studies of ancient DNA from early farmers in the Balkans and Central Europe show they were not simply local hunter-gatherers who picked up crops from neighbours. They carry a clear signature of ancestry from populations around Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean, with additional hints of input from the Black Sea region. When geneticists tease apart these lineages, some migration streams seem to skirt along the northern arc of the Black Sea and then turn up the Danube. Others pass through northwest Anatolia and cross into Europe via the Bosporus Straits and the Thracian plain. It's messy. Human history almost always is. But in broad strokes, you see exactly the routes you would expect if groups living around a rising Black Sea decided in waves to abandon the drowning shores and follow river valleys inland. Language, which leaves even worse fossils than DNA, still whispers similar suggestions. Many historical linguists think some of the deep roots of the Indo-European language family lie somewhere near the Black Sea Caucasus region. That hypothesis is hotly debated, and it stretches long past the Neolithic. But if you zoom way out, you again see patterns of expansion radiating from roughly the same broad zone. North along the steppe, west into Europe, south into Anatolia and the Near East. None of this proves that flood refugees drove those movements, but it sketches a backdrop in which such a scattering would fit naturally. Material culture tells a more tactile version of the story. In the centuries after the proposed flood date, certain pottery styles begin to fan outward from the Black Sea margins like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Around the lower Danube you get the colourful, spiral-decorated ceramics of the Cucuteni Tripilia and related cultures. Farther southwest in the Balkans, the Vincha and related complexes appear, with their own distinctive motifs and figurines. To the north, along the Bug and Dniester, other painted and impressed wares spread. These styles aren't identical, but archaeologists can trace shared elements, ways of shaping rims, typical vessel forms, decorative habits, that suggest either common ancestry or intense contact between groups that had once lived closer together. Agricultural techniques show similar echoes, practices like ploughing lighter soils with simple ards, specific ways of building storage pits, particular methods of house construction, rectangular wattle and daub structures with standard internal layouts, appear, clustered more densely in areas that line up with the likely migration routes from the Black Sea basin. It's as if a toolkit of habits, skills, and aesthetics unmoored from a drowning shore and then reassembled itself, piece by piece, along new rivers and in new clearings. Now add one more ingredient: memory. Imagine what it would feel like to be part of such a movement. You're not just a family seeking better pasture or trade. You're someone who has watched the world literally shrink around you. Who has seen familiar landmarks swallowed? Who has buried your dead near a shoreline that no longer exists? When you arrive in a new valley and dig post holes for a new house, the ground itself must feel untrustworthy. Solid, but for how long? In small evening circles around new hearths, stories would naturally turn backward. To the old lake, to the fertile shore that fed everyone, to the day the water came too fast or too high, or simply never stopped coming. Children born inland would grow up on those tales. They would never see the original landscape, but they would inherit the feeling that once, long ago, the land itself betrayed their people, that once, long ago, the water rose and did not retreat. Over generations, those memories would change. Specific place names would be lost. The exact depth and rate of the flooding would blur. What would remain was the emotional outline, abundance, warning ignored or unseen, then catastrophic loss and desperate flight. A people who have survived that don't migrate like casual pioneers. They move with urgency, with trauma, with an awareness that everything can vanish. Their myths, if any formed from those experiences, would not be gentle nature parables. They would be flood stories. Now, if you talk to many archaeologists, you will hear a different emphasis. They point out that the spread of farming into Europe began well before the Black Sea event, that settlements in Greece and the Balkans were already established centuries earlier, that population pressure, climate variability, and the slow pull of new opportunities can explain the Neolithic expansion perfectly well without invoking a single dramatic catastrophe. In this view, the Danube and its neighbours carried farmers inland because rivers are good at that, not because of refugees fleeing a cataclysm. Pottery styles spread because people trade and imitate, not because a drowned civilization scattered its shards across a continent. Some researchers go further and question whether the Black Sea flood, even if real, would have been as sudden or as devastating for human communities as the most dramatic versions suggest. Perhaps the water rose more gradually. Perhaps people adapted smoothly, moving bit by bit without any single traumatic exodus. Those are important cautions. The evidence we have, potsherds, charred seeds, DNA fragments, submerged timbers, is rich but partial. It can support different stories, depending on how you connect the dots. But late at night, when you look at the map and trace with your finger the arcs of rivers running away from the Black Sea, when you overlay the timelines of shoreline change, village growth, cultural spread, and genetic mixing, one picture is hard to shake. A lake became a sea. Its shores dissolved, and the people who once lived there did not vanish. They walked. They paddled up rivers in small boats. They led animals along game trails that became migration corridors. They carried seed grain, tools, and the memory of an impossible wall of water. In their footsteps, Europe's first great farming cultures blossomed, and in their dreams perhaps the old shoreline kept crumbling again and again, every time they closed their eyes. Those dreams would not stay private forever. In the next ages, as their descendants learned to carve stone stelae, to recite long genealogies, to weave meaning into the stars, the memory of the great drowning would begin to change shape. It would become a story. The first version of that story is simple. The water rose, we ran. But stories, unlike shorelines, don't stay simple for long. Generations pass. The people who actually saw the waves flatten their fields are gone. Their grandchildren are born far inland, on river terraces or in crowded new villages, where the sea is something you hear about, not something you see. Now the story needs more. Why did the water rise? Why us and not them? Why did some survive when so many didn't? As soon as you start asking those questions, you've left geology behind and stepped into mythology. This is where cultural memory takes over. Psychologists sometimes talk about flashbulb memories, those vivid, frozen images people carry of shocking events. Where you were when the earthquake hit, what you were doing when the siren started. Communities have something similar. In small, tightly knit societies, a major trauma doesn't just live in a few individual minds. It gets retold, rehearsed, woven into nightly conversations, into initiation rituals, into warnings for children. Don't build too close to the water. Don't ignore the signs. Those warnings grow teeth when they're attached to a story everyone knows. You can imagine how it works. An old woman who remembers the sound of the first breach sits by a fire and tells a group of squirming children how the sea once leapt up and swallowed the world. Her voice catches when she recalls the last dry hilltop, the last night in the old settlement. Her listeners never experience those things, but they feel them. They absorb the fear and the awe. Their brains, tuned by evolution to treat emotionally charged stories as important, file that tale away in a special category. This matters. Later, when those children are grown, they will tell their own versions. They'll add details, polish the dramatic moments, maybe simplify the confusing bits. Over time, individual memories crystallize into a shared narrative, a myth. And myths aren't just old stories, they're social tools. They explain why the world is the way it is. They justify customs. They bind people together by giving them a sense of common origin and common fate. A remembered flood is perfect material. It's terrifying, visual, easily dramatized. It carries obvious lessons. Be humble, respect the forces that keep you alive, don't take abundance for granted. It can also be shaped to answer a deeper, more unsettling question. Why are we here and not there? For people whose ancestors fled a drowned homeland, that question would haunt everything. The flood becomes not just an event, but the hinge on which their entire identity turns. So the story grows. Maybe at first it's just, our ancestors lived by a great lake. The lake became angry. It rose and chased them. They escaped in boats. Then someone adds, the lake rose because people failed to share, or because they broke an oath, or because they angered the spirits of the water. Now the flood explains morality as well as geography. Give it a few hundred years, and the same story will have splintered into many versions, scattered along the routes those refugees took, into Anatolia, down into the Fertile Crescent along the Danube. Most of those early versions never reached writing. They flickered through the air in spoken words, sung in ritual laments, murmured in prayers, carved indirectly into the alignments of temples and the placement of altars, but eventually some did make it onto clay. When we first see a full flood story in the historical record, it appears in southern Mesopotamia, in Sumerian. It's the tale of Ziusudra. The tablets we have come from around 1600 BCE, but even conservative scholars think they're copying much older material, passed down orally for centuries before scribes ever pressed a reed into wet clay to record it. The outlines are familiar. The gods decide to send a flood to wipe out humankind. One god, favouring a particular man, Ziusudra, whispers the secret, tells him to build a great boat, to load it with animals and the seed of all living things. The waters rise, the storm rages, the world is scrubbed clean. When the flood finally recedes, Ziusudra opens a window, sees that the land is drying, and offers sacrifice to the gods who saved him. Strip away the divine politics, and you're left with a stark, almost plausible core. A leader warned, a hurried construction, a desperate flight on a crowded vessel, a new world waiting when the waters fall. A few centuries later, the same narrative appears again, more elaborate, more literary in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Here the survivor is called Utnapishtim, but his story is clearly a reworked, expanded version of the older Sumerian flood myth. He too receives a warning. He too builds a boat, not a little river skiff, but a vast box-like ark sealed with pitch, its dimensions carefully specified. He loads it with his family, with craftsmen, with animals. The storm that follows is described in almost physical terms. The gods weep, the flood roars like a bull, the land is shattered like a clay pot. When the waters finally calm, Utnapishtim's boat comes to rest on a distant mountain. He sends out birds to see if the land has re-emerged. First a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. When the raven doesn't return, he knows there is dry ground somewhere. If you imagine a Black Sea farmer forced onto a hastily reinforced boat as the shoreline crumbles, you can hear echoes here that go beyond ordinary river floods. In the Tigris-Euphrates basin, seasonal inundations were common and predictable. They could be destructive, yes, but they also brought fertile silt, and people adapted to them with levees and canals. The flood in these myths is not that. It is not a high river. It is the end of the world. The water doesn't just spill over a bank and then slip back. It covers the mountains. It drowns entire cities. It forces survivors to live for days or weeks on the heaving surface itself, cut off from any land at all. That scale feels more like the experience of a small community watching an entire coastline drown than like a bad year on the river. And there's another layer. By the time Ziusudra and Utnapishtim are written down, the societies of Mesopotamia are already old. They have long memories. They keep king lists that reach back into legendary prehistory. They preserve city names and lineages that stretch far beyond what archaeology can easily confirm. Embedded in those long lines of transmission, it's at least possible that older, stranger things survived. Stories brought by migrants whose ancestors had once lived on a very different shore. This isn't just romantic speculation. We have a modern test case. On the far side of the world, Aboriginal communities in Australia preserve oral traditions that linguists and geologists have started to compare with past landscapes. In some coastal groups there are stories of land that once lay where the sea now stretches, of hunting grounds now underwater, of islands that used to be peninsulas. When researchers reconstruct sea level changes and drowned shorelines after the last ice age, some of those tales line up uncannily well with features that went under between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. If those correlations are real, and many experts think at least some are, it means oral traditions can carry recognizable traces of real events for enormous spans of time. Not perfectly, not like a photograph, but as a kind of mythic map with distorted yet still meaningful contours. If Australian stories can remember a post-glacial shoreline for 7,000 years, is it really impossible that people in the Near East, 4,000 or 5,000 years after the Black Sea changed from lake to sea, might still be telling, reshaping and ritualizing tales of a time when the waters came and never left? Once those people settled in the river plains of Mesopotamia, the fit between experience and environment would have been almost too tempting. You live between unpredictable rivers, watching water dictate the fate of crops, towns, armies. Your inherited story says your ancestors once fled a rising sea. You already remember that water can be both giver and destroyer of life. Merge those strands, and you get something like the Mesopotamian flood myths we know, a cosmicized version of a real ancestral terror, projected onto the familiar landscape of rivers, framed in the language of gods and destinies. From there, the story keeps travelling. Later cultures, Akkadian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, will borrow, adapt, and overlay their own concerns onto the same basic template. A world grown corrupt, a divine decision, a chosen survivor, a boat, a flood that wipes the slate clean. Whether the first spark of that template came from a drowned Black Sea shore, is something we may never be able to prove, but it's a tantalizing possibility that deep beneath the theology and poetry, beneath the cuneiform lines and the biblical verses, lies a much older memory. A time when ordinary people watched the horizon change shape, heard a new roar on the wind, and understood, with a clarity that needed no gods to explain it, that the world they knew had ended. From that moment on, they didn't just carry tools and seeds into their new homes. They carried the story of the water, and they told it until it became a myth. Once a story like that exists, it doesn't like to stay put. It spreads. It crosses mountains and deserts far more easily than the people who first told it. It slips into new languages, new religions, new landscapes. The details change. The bones stay the same. In the ancient Near East, those bones are easiest to see. Long after Ziusudra and Utnapishtim, another community speaking a related but different language, living under different empires, takes that flood pattern and threads it into a new sacred history. In the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Genesis, the hero is called Noah. Here the flood is no longer just a divine overreaction, or a way to thin out noisy humans, as in some Mesopotamian versions. It becomes a moral drama. The earth was filled with violence, the text says. Human wickedness has reached a point that the God of Israel can no longer tolerate. The solution is radical. Uncreate the world by water, then start again. Again we see the same structure. A warning, or at least a revelation. The flood is coming. A chosen man, singled out for his righteousness. A vessel, this time called an ark, measured out in exact ratios. 3 decks, pitch inside and out. Not a river barge, but a floating world. Pairs of animals, or in some passages larger groups, brought aboard to preserve every living thing of all flesh. 40 days of rain, then long drifting weeks as the waters cover all the high mountains under the whole heaven. When the ark finally grounds itself on the slopes of Ararat, Noah sends out a raven, then a dove. The dove returns with an olive leaf, and humanity's second chance begins. This is not a simple borrowing. The theology is different. The character of God is different. The purpose of the flood is different. But the literary ancestry is obvious enough that even quite conservative scholars acknowledge the connection. The core plotline, the technical details of boat building and bird releasing, the idea of a single family riding out an almost total extinction event. These are clear echoes of Mesopotamian stories that were already centuries old when Genesis was taking shape. But even as that particular tradition was crystallizing in the Near East, other cultures, far from the Tigris and Euphrates, were telling their own versions of a world-drowning sea. In Greece, the myth focuses on a man named Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. The setup is familiar by now. Humanity has grown arrogant, impious. Zeus, looking down from Olympus, decides the experiment has failed. Fire would be too quick, plague too small, so he chooses water. One just man, Deucalion, sometimes described as the son of Prometheus, the trickster who gave fire to humans, is warned. In some versions, Prometheus himself whispers the secret. Deucalion and Pyrrha build not an ark exactly, but a great chest, a sealed box sturdy enough to ride the waves. The storm comes, rivers overflow, the sea surges inland, whole cities vanish. For 9 days and nights, the couple drift on an endless, featureless flood. When the waters finally subside, their chest runs aground on a mountain, often identified as Parnassus. They emerge into a washed, empty world. No pairs of animals here, no explicit cargo of seeds. Instead, the question is how to repopulate the land. An oracle tells them to throw the bones of your mother over your shoulder. After some puzzled debate, they decide mother must mean Gaia, the earth itself. So they pick up stones and toss them behind them as they walk. From the stones that Deucalion throws, men arise. From those thrown by Pyrrha, women, different gods, different geography, different symbolic logic. But underneath the Greek poetic flourishes lies the same skeleton, a world so saturated with water that the only high ground left is mythic, the only survivors isolated enough to feel like a second Adam and Eve. Travel further east into the Indo-Gangetic world, and you find yet another variation. In early Hindu traditions, the figure is called Manu, the archetypal man, the lawgiver, the ancestor of future humanity. One day, as the legend goes, Manu is washing his hands in a river when he notices a tiny fish caught in his cupped palms. The fish speaks, asking for protection. If Manu spares it and cares for it, the fish says, it will one day save him in return. Manu agrees. He keeps the fish in a jar, but it grows. He moves it to a pond, then a lake, then finally releases it into the ocean. Each time the fish, now enormous, warns him of a coming flood that will destroy all life. The fish is no ordinary creature. In later tellings it is identified as an incarnation of Vishnu, the preserver god, taking form as Matsya, the great fish. Forewarned, Manu builds a boat. When the waters rise, he climbs aboard, bringing with him the seeds of plants, the 7 sages, and the tools needed to re-establish life. The fish, now colossal, appears with a horn on its head. Manu ties his boat to the horn with a serpent as a rope, and Matsya tows them through the churning waters until they reach the safety of a mountaintop. Again, warning, chosen man, constructed vessel, cargo that represents the continuity of life, a mountain where the boat comes to rest. Same template, completely different pantheon, philosophical context and ritual use. At this point the pattern is hard to ignore. Near Eastern, Greek, Indian, 3 distinct cultural spheres, stitching the same narrative geometry into their sacred and mythic texts. And it doesn't stop there. Look across the world's traditions, and flood stories are everywhere. In ancient China, there is the long tangled saga of Gun and Yu. In the earliest versions, this is less a single cataclysm than a civilization-defining struggle against endless waters. The world is in chaos. Floods pour from the heavens, cover the plains, swallow villages. Gun, a culture hero, tries to stop them by stealing a divine, self-expanding soil to build dams. His efforts fail, or bring punishment. His son, Yu, takes a different approach. Instead of blocking the water, he channels it, digging canals, opening new paths to the sea, reshaping the landscape. By the end, the waters recede, the land is made habitable, and Yu becomes the mythical founder of China's first dynasty. Here the emphasis is on engineering, on order wrestled from chaos. But again you can feel some deep memory of a time when water was the primary threat to everything humans had built. In Mesoamerica, several cultures remember earlier worlds destroyed by deluges. In one Aztec cycle, the gods create successive suns, each presiding over its own age. One of those ages ends in water. Rain pours until people are turned into fish, mountains disappear, the sky collapses. In some Mayan accounts, as in the Popol Vuh, the gods destroy a flawed creation with a flood and crashing objects from the sky, then start again with better materials, better humans. Among indigenous cultures of North America, the variations are even more numerous. Pacific Northwest stories speak of great canoes riding out a flood that covers even the tallest cedar trees, of people tying their boats to mountain peaks with long ropes of cedar bark. In some plains traditions, only a few people and animals survive on a lone raft. In others, trickster figures like Coyote outwit the waters, or a muskrat dives to the bottom of the flood to bring up a bit of mud that will become the new earth. Strip them down, and many of these tales share the same motifs: excess water as cosmic reset, a small remnant saved by foresight, luck, or divine favour, and the daunting task of beginning again when the ground finally dries. So what's going on? Are all these stories distant ripples from one original catastrophe? Or are they independent responses to a very general human experience? Rains that seem endless, rivers that suddenly run where towns used to stand, coasts that erode and vanish. Scholars line up along a spectrum. At one end are those who suspect a single singular event behind at least the densely connected cluster of Near Eastern and Mediterranean myths. They point to geology. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose more than 100 meters worldwide. Localized disasters would have been common: glacial lakes bursting, coastlines collapsing, deltas drowning. The Black Sea flood, if it happened quickly, is one of the most dramatic of these. A vast inhabited freshwater basin suddenly invaded by the Mediterranean, its shores chewed backward day after day, its level climbing dozens of meters in a human lifetime. Refugees carrying their trauma south and east into lands that would later become the heartlands of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Israel, Greece. From this perspective, you don't need the Black Sea to explain every flood story on Earth, but you might only need it to explain one particularly influential branch, the Mesopotamian one. And through that branch, the Genesis story, the Greek Deucalion myth, and perhaps even some later echoes in surrounding cultures. At the other end of the spectrum are researchers who see something more psychological, even archetypal. Floods, they argue, are among the most common and visually overwhelming natural disasters humans face. They erase boundaries, swallow houses, mix the contents of the world together in a way that feels both terrifying and cleansing. It's almost inevitable that different societies confronting the same kind of event would arrive at similar symbolic interpretations. Water as punishment, water as renewal, water as the great eraser and the blank page. In this view, you don't need a single historical deluge. You just need human brains that like to think in patterns and landscapes where water occasionally breaks those patterns in catastrophic ways. Between these poles lies a middle ground. Multiple real floods, some small, some enormous, feeding into a shared human habit of telling certain kinds of stories about loss and rebirth. Within that middle ground, the Black Sea still stands out. Chronologically, it sits in an intriguing position, late enough that its descendants could be part of the Neolithic wave into Anatolia and the Fertile Crescent, early enough that their memories could be old by the time writing appears but still distantly recognizable. Geographically, it's plugged into exactly the corridors that matter. The Balkans, Anatolia, the Caucasus, the northern approaches to Mesopotamia. A flood there doesn't strand its survivors on some remote island. It pours them directly into the regions that later give us Ziusudra, Utnapishtim and Noah. Culturally, if the people around the old freshwater lake had already begun farming, building villages, carving out a settled way of life, then the trauma of seeing not just camps but fields and ancestors' graves vanish under salt water would have been profound. This isn't a river overflowing and receding. It's the permanent loss of a homeland, the permanent conversion of our land into the sea. That kind of change is exactly the sort of thing that tends to echo for millennia. So maybe when we line up Noah, Deucalion, Manu, the Chinese flood heroes, the canoes tied to mountain peaks on the far Pacific coast, we're not seeing copies of one story, but a family reunion of many. Some are cousins, sharing a recent ancestor in the flood epics of Mesopotamia. Some are only related at the level of psychology and symbol, and somewhere back in the deep half-lit recesses of human memory, there may be a few old stubborn details in that Mesopotamian branch, a box-like boat, a mountain where the waters stop, a sense that the sea itself once invaded the land, that trace their lineage not just to a river in spate, but to a day when the Black Sea stopped being a lake, a day when one shoreline village after another learned, the hard way, that sometimes the world does not slowly change, sometimes it tips. Not everyone is convinced that the Black Sea is where the story begins, or at least not in the way the original Black Sea flood hypothesis imagined. When William Ryan and Walter Pitman first published their idea in the late 1990s, it was a cinematic proposal. A towering waterfall at the Bosporus, a roaring jet of Mediterranean water tearing into a lower landlocked lake, shorelines drowned in months, villages swallowed almost overnight. A real, geologically documented great flood that could have seeded the Mesopotamian myths. It was neat, maybe a little too neat. Pretty quickly, other geologists, oceanographers, and archaeologists started poking at the details. The first line of criticism was simple. Was the Black Sea really cut off at all? As more sediment cores were pulled from the seabed, more shells dated, more microfossils examined, some researchers noticed something awkward. In several cores, the transition from freshwater organisms to saltwater ones didn't look like a cliff. It looked like a slope. Instead of a sharp, catastrophic change, you see a gradual increase in marine species over time, brackish conditions, mixed communities, a slow, messy transition, not a clean, sudden invasion. If the Black Sea was already connected to the Mediterranean through shallow channels or through periodic spillovers, then the supposed moment of reconnection becomes fuzzier. The lake might have been more like a semi-isolated basin, filling and draining over millennia as global sea level rose, rather than a pristine freshwater bowl suddenly shattered by the sea. Then there's the speed of the rise itself. Ryan and Pitman's original model imagined water levels climbing tens of centimetres per day at the shoreline, enough that you could watch your beach vanish over a single summer. Later work has often revised that downward. Some reconstructions suggest an infill on the order of years to centuries, not weeks. From a geological perspective, that's still very fast. From a human perspective, it's more ambiguous. Fast enough to be traumatic. Slow enough that people could move, adapt, resettle, tell stories not about a single day of terror but about a generation of loss. Critics also point out that, even if there was a significant transgression, the archaeological record around the Black Sea doesn't show a clear, synchronized cultural collapse matching a sudden, catastrophic flood. Some Neolithic communities inland and on higher ground seem to have continued without obvious interruption. That doesn't disprove local disasters along the old shoreline, but it does complicate the image of a basin-wide apocalypse. And there's another twist. Ryan and Pitman's scenario depends on the Mediterranean being higher than the Black Sea, so water flows in. But when you rewind sea levels and isostatic adjustments, how land rises or falls under the weight of ice and water, some models suggest an opposite phase at certain times. In those reconstructions, the Black Sea, fed by huge rivers like the Danube, Dniester, and Dnieper, may have sat higher than the Mediterranean. Instead of waiting passively for the ocean to invade it, it could have periodically spilled out through the Bosporus, pouring fresh water into a lower, saltier sea. This is the outflow hypothesis. In that view, the Black Sea isn't a victim of the Mediterranean. It's a donor, a massive freshwater source regulating salinity in the eastern Mediterranean, perhaps even influencing circulation patterns. If that's right for some parts of the last 20,000 years, then the story is not a simple one-way catastrophe. The direction of flow might have flipped back and forth as global sea level rose and regional conditions shifted, sometimes lake pouring into sea, sometimes sea creeping into lake, a long complex hydraulic dance rather than a single irreversible break. The debate has not stayed frozen in its 1997 form. Every few years someone publishes a new batch of data, a refined radiocarbon date on a shell layer, a new seismic profile of buried shorelines, a fresh model of post-ice age sea levels that tweaks the relative heights of basins by a few meters. High-resolution cores now show finely layered sediments, varves, that can be counted like tree rings, giving more precise timelines. Improved calibration curves for radiocarbon dating tighten the error bars. DNA from ancient plankton trapped in mud gives clues about salinity and temperature changes. Taken together, these lines of evidence have nudged the conversation away from the early, dramatic giant waterfall picture towards something more nuanced. Many researchers today lean toward a model in which the Black Sea did experience a significant marine transgression, but perhaps not as abruptly or uniformly as first imagined. Localized surges, rapid but not instantaneous shoreline retreat, rising water complicated by subsidence of deltas, storms and river floods. Enough perhaps to traumatize individual communities, maybe not enough, on its own, to serve as the unequivocal one flood to rule them all. And that's where alternative candidates slip in. Because the Holocene, the last 11,700 years or so, the warm, relatively stable period in which agriculture and city appear, is not as calm as the word stable suggests. It is studded with regional floods, slips and drownings. In southern Mesopotamia, the archaeologist Leonard Woolley, excavating at in the 1920s, found a thick layer of clean river silt sandwiched between human occupation levels, evidence of a massive flood in the 3rd millennium BCE. He famously linked it to the biblical deluge. Later work showed the picture was more complicated than that early enthusiasm allowed. The flood layer at is not universal across all Mesopotamian sites. It seems to represent a very large but still regional river flood, disastrous for the cities it hit, but not a world-wiping cataclysm. Still, if you're looking for vivid, generationally retold flood memories in the very heartland of the Gilgamesh and Ziusudra traditions, events like that are strong contenders. Further southeast, the Persian Gulf holds another possibility. At the end of the last ice age, what is now open water was a broad, low-lying plain, watered by the combined Tigris-Euphrates-Karen system. Some researchers have suggested that this Gulf oasis might have supported rich early communities, fishing, foraging, perhaps experimenting with cultivation, before being gradually drowned as sea level rose. From that angle, some Mesopotamian flood memories could be displaced recollections of a lost coastal world now under the Gulf, rather than, or in addition to, anything that happened at the Black Sea. To the northwest, between Britain and continental Europe, lies another drowned land, Doggerland. During the last glacial maximum and for thousands of years afterward, the North Sea was largely dry land. Rivers, wetlands, forests, rich hunting grounds. By around 8,000 years ago, rising seas had narrowed Doggerland into a low-lying archipelago. Then, around 8,200 years ago, a massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, triggered tsunamis that slammed into these shallow coasts. For people living there, this would not have been a gentle, decades-long transgression. It would have been a wall of water, an overnight erasure of villages and shorelines. Did that event echo in later northern European myths? In tales of giants drowning, of lands sunken beneath the waves, of lost kingdoms like Lyonesse or Atlantis-like stories on a smaller scale? It's impossible to trace a direct line, but the physical raw material is certainly there. And the Mediterranean itself has its own history of sea level jumps, storm surges, and sudden coastal collapses. The drowning of early harbours, the overtopping of low-lying plains, the kind of local disasters that don't leave global signatures, but leave very deep marks on the communities they strike. All of which raises a bigger question. Are we even right to expect one origin point for flood myths? Stories are not fossils. They don't preserve the way bones do, locked into a single layer. They are more like palimpsests, manuscripts scraped and written over, older ink still faintly visible beneath the newer text. A community that already has a vague ancestral tale about a time when the waters rose might encounter a new flood centuries later. The fresh trauma doesn't erase the older memory. It folds into it. Details merge, swap places, modernize. Boat types change in the telling. Local mountains get substituted in as the place where the waters stopped. The god who sends the deluge shifts as pantheons rise and fall. A story that might once have dimly remembered a slowly drowning Gulf plain now borrows imagery from a more recent river catastrophe, or from a Black Sea shoreline that vanished under salt water generations before. Under that light, the search for a single, precise catastrophe that explains Noah or Utnapishtim starts to look a little too tidy. It may be that the myths we inherit are composites, layers of many different real events, Black Sea transgressions, Mesopotamian river floods, drowning coasts in the Gulf, Doggerland tsunamis, unrecorded local disasters, pressed together by centuries of retelling into one concentrated narrative. That doesn't make them less interesting. If anything, it makes them more so, because then each story is not a simple report of a single day, but a kind of deep time-weathered artifact, bearing the fingerprints of multiple ages, multiple landscapes, multiple crises. And that's where the debate around the Black Sea settles for now, not into certainty but into tension. On one side, the pull of specific geology, shorelines, cores, isotope ratios, radiocarbon dates that whisper of a big, strange event in a very suggestive place around 7,600 years ago. On the other, the recognition that the human imagination doesn't wait politely for one perfect disaster. It weaves with whatever threads it has, rivers that overflow, seas that creep landward, tsunamis that appear out of a clear morning and are gone by afternoon. Scientists argue about inflow versus outflow, about rates of rise, about the exact timing of shell beds and sand layers. Models are revised. Rebuttals are written, new data nudges interpretations left, then right again. The picture grows more complicated, not less. But the basic fascination remains. Somewhere between the mud at the bottom of the Black Sea and the ink of the oldest tablets, between submerged plains and sung epics, lies a relationship we don't yet fully understand, a conversation between earth and story, between what water actually did and what humans say it did. The uncertainty isn't a flaw in that conversation. It's the point. It's what keeps the questions alive, lets you fall asleep tonight not with a closed case, but with an open file, a coastline half seen through mist, voices across time disagreeing gently about what exactly happened when the sea came in. So where does that leave us? If there was no single, neat, global deluge, if the Black Sea was just one chapter in a much messier book, why do flood stories feel so heavy, so charged with meaning? Because the myths were never just about water. Listen to the way they're told. There is almost always a reason the flood comes. People have forgotten the gods or become corrupt or noisy or violent. The world has grown wrong somehow. The water is not just an accident, it's a verdict. In Genesis, the earth is filled with violence before the heavens open. In Mesopotamia, humans are too numerous and too loud, disturbing the sleep of the gods. In some Indian traditions, time itself is cyclical. Each age decays until Vishnu, as the fish Matsya, warns Manu to build his boat before the waters of dissolution roll in. Again and again, the pattern repeats. First, excess. Then a warning, often to a single attentive person. Then the deluge. Then a small remnant carried through the chaos. Then, on the far side, a covenant, a promise. The bough in the clouds, the reed basket with seeds, the instructions for sacrifice. A new law. These are not stories about random disaster. They're stories about judgment and reset. About the idea that sometimes a world can't just be fixed. It has to be washed away and restarted, smaller, cleaner, more attentive to the rules written into the structure of things. Underneath the theological language, you can hear something more ordinary and human. people trying to make sense of the fact that entire ways of life really do end. Because the flood, whether in myth or in the drowned archaeology of the Holocene, is always about more than water creeping up a beach. It's about the end of an age. When we talk about a Black Sea shoreline vanishing, or a Gulf oasis slowly drowning, or a river plain wiped flat by a freak season, we're also talking about the death of particular cultures. Foragers who knew every bend of a river, every seasonal shoal of fish. Early farmers who had finally learned the moods of their local floodplain, only to watch that knowledge become useless. In southeastern Europe, those early Neolithic hamlets along the Black Sea weren't just losing houses. They were losing a whole grammar for living with that landscape. The plants you gather shift. The fish species change. The soils are different inland. Your calendar based on spawning runs or reed blooms suddenly doesn't apply. From a distance of thousands of years, we talk about the transition from Mesolithic to Neolithic, from hunter-gatherers to farmers, as if it were a clean change of costume. It wasn't. It was messy and painful and very often forced. Rising seas squeeze people into smaller, more crowded spaces. Former coastlines become bays. Fertile lowlands turn to marsh, then open water. Communities that had been spread out are pushed together on higher ground. People who had once moved seasonally now find their old routes blocked or underwater. Under that kind of pressure, things accelerate. You intensify agriculture because you can't just walk away to a new valley anymore. You irrigate, terrace, fuss over seeds, keep animals penned instead of loosely herded. You build dikes and levees, you experiment or you starve. You organize more tightly because land and water are no longer an endless backdrop. They're pointedly finite. Boundaries start to matter. Who controls which canal, whose fields get the first flood water, whose village sits closest to the new shoreline? Out of those arguments, administration is born. You need people who remember which family owns which strip of land, whose storehouses hold surplus from last year's good harvest, how much labour each household owes to keep the dikes intact. You need to count, to record, to plan. It is not an accident that the earliest cities we know rise in river deltas and alluvial plains that have been reshaped by post-Ice Age sea level rise. Southern Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, places where water gives and then takes, and then gives again if you manage it just right. In that sense, catastrophe doesn't just destroy, it compresses, it forces choices, it creates conditions where new, more complex forms of social life become not just useful, but necessary. Somewhere in the genealogy of Ur and Uruk, of Eridu and Lagash, there may have been small, scared groups trudging away from a shoreline that had swallowed their grandparents' homes, bringing with them seeds, tools, memories and stories of the time when the world ended and began again. Stories more than anything else. Because if you think about it, a flood story is a survival manual disguised as a moral tale. Once, long ago, the waters rose higher than anyone remembered. Only the person who listened to the warning survived. He built a boat, he stored food, he took animals, he watched the sky. When the birds did this, he knew it was safe. When the waters did that, he knew it wasn't. Details like that, told and retold, are not just entertainment. They're data. Oral tradition is humanity's first hard drive. It stores information about where to camp and where never to camp, about which river valleys have betrayed people before, about the strange pattern in the weather that means the mountain is going to shed ice, about which plants are edible and which will kill you on the second day, not the first. Wrapped in gods and heroes and talking fish, flood stories quietly encode advice. Don't build too close to the water, no matter how rich the soil looks. Watch the animals. Sometimes they know before you do. Trust the one old person who says, "This has happened before." If you must abandon everything, here is what you save first. We don't know how much practical detail about ancient Black Sea shorelines, or Gulf plains, or drowned deltas survived in this way. But we do know that oral cultures can carry astonishingly precise environmental knowledge across hundreds of generations. In parts of Australia, Aboriginal stories describe coastal features that were above water more than 7,000 years ago. In the Pacific, myths remember volcanic eruptions and tsunamis that modern geology can date. The line between mythic flood and ancestral field report is blurrier than it looks, which brings us back gently to the Black Sea. Somewhere under that dark stratified water, past the layer where oxygen vanishes and life thins out, there may be a village, a real one. Wattle and daub walls still standing in the cold, salty blackness. Clay pots resting where they were last set down. A hearth, a doorway. Maybe a child's toy, a carved figure abandoned on the packed earth floor when the water finally lapped at the threshold. No light has touched those things in perhaps 7,600 years. No eyes have seen them since the people who lived there walked uphill, away from the only world they had ever known. If underwater archaeologists ever find such a place, and it's possible they already have in hints and sonar shadows, it will be easy to describe it in technical language. A Neolithic lakeshore settlement, inundated by a mid-Holocene marine transgression. But that's not how it felt from the inside. From the inside it was a flood. It was the end of a world, followed, slowly, painfully, by the beginning of another. New fields on higher terraces, new fishing grounds in unfamiliar bays, new neighbours, speaking strange dialects, arriving from the other direction with their own stories of retreating from the water. In time, the specifics blur. The names of the old coves and inlets are forgotten. The exact year the last house went under slides out of memory. What remains is shape, pattern. The sense that once, long ago, everything was washed away and only a few survived. Patterns like that are stubborn. They cling. They echo in Noah and Utnapishtim, in Deucalion and Pyrrha, in Manu and his fish, in unnamed local tales never written down. They stitch together events separated by centuries and continents into one archetype: loss, judgment, survival, renewal. And tonight, as you lie here listening, you're doing something eerily similar. You're floating at the surface of your own consciousness, letting the waking world slip beneath you. Thoughts blur, details soften, the hard edges of the day dissolve. You move from one state into another, the way a shoreline once moved, imperceptibly and yet decisively, from land into sea. Sleep is a kind of private flood. It washes over memory, rearranging, solidifying some things, eroding others. It turns raw experience into story. Down below, under the Black Sea, nothing moves. Silt settles grain by grain. Wooden beams quietly mineralize. A ceramic bowl waits in the dark where a hand once left it. Up here, your breathing slows. Neurons fire in gentle, synchronized waves. Somewhere in that quiet electrical sea, the old human patterns are still at work. Fear and adaptation, loss and meaning-making, the endless urge to take chaos and wrap it in narrative so we can live with it. The people who watched the Black Sea rise or the rivers of Mesopotamia break their banks didn't have charts or models. They had each other, and they had stories. You have them too. You carry the descendants of their genes and the distant reflections of their myths. You live in a world where seas are rising again, slowly but inexorably, and once more we're trying to turn that fact into something we can understand, plan for, endure. Between the silent villages under the waves and the silent rooms where we fall asleep, there is the same thread, remembrance. We tell flood stories not just to explain what happened, but to remind ourselves that people have stood in that rising water before, and some of them found a way through. And as the world outside your window fades, and the last words of this story sink into the background noise of your thoughts, you join that long, unbroken line of listeners, waiting on a shore between worlds, letting the tide come in. And so we circle back to where we began. A world beneath the waves, a vanished freshwater lake, ringed by quiet villages and new fields, turned almost overnight into an inland sea. We've followed that shoreline from its soft reed-filled edges to the moment the salt water came pouring in, watched the beaches narrow, the water darken, the homes retreat step by reluctant step uphill. We've traced the people who left, north into Europe, south and east along new coasts, carrying seeds, tools, and the memory of a place that no longer existed. We watched those memories change as they moved, from eyewitness stories of the year the sea ate the fields, to campfire tales of ancestors who escaped a great drowning. From there into myth, where the water is sent by gods or fate, and one family rides it out in a boat or a chest or a giant fish, a lost paradise, a sudden rising, a scattering, and in the end the birth of some of humanity's oldest, most enduring stories. The next time you hear about Noah closing the ark's door, or Deucalion and Pyrrha tossing stones over their shoulders to repopulate the earth, or Manu tying his boat to the horn of a divine fish, you might hear them a little differently. You might hear, under the thunder and the divine decrees, something faint but persistent. The echo of real feet squelching through flooded fields, real voices arguing over whether to stay one more season, real hands stacking the last bundle of belongings on a hire cart as the water laps at the threshold. Every flood story we tell might be carrying, buried deep inside, a tiny fossil of that experience, a compressed shard of memory from people who stood and watched their horizons sink. If this journey through their possible world kept you company tonight, if it helped you drift a little closer to sleep, it would mean a lot if you gently tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more quiet dives into deep time. And if you feel like sharing, tell us where you're listening from tonight. A city far inland, a coastal town, a mountain valley, all the little places where this story of water is finding you. If your curiosity is still awake, and you'd like to wander further into the hidden ages before history, there's a book waiting for you, filled with more prehistoric secrets and half-forgotten worlds at sleepytimehistory.com. You can explore at your own pace whenever you're ready. For now, though, you don't have to go anywhere. You can let your own inner shoreline soften and blur. Let the day recede like a low tide, leaving only the smooth, simple shapes of rest behind. Thank you for keeping watch here, at the edge between past and present, waking and sleep. May your night be calm, your dreams gentle, and your mind as quiet as the still water over a buried, forgotten shore. Good night.